What if I told you that the man who bequeathed upon the world art's most enigmatic smile actually spent vastly more time developing weapons of mass destruction? Conventional wisdom holds that his armored vehicles, rapid-fire cannons, and combat diving suits were merely the innocent fantasies of a genius, intellectual exercises on paper that bore no resemblance to reality. But that's a convenient half-truth. What we have before us isn't an artist's biography, but a dossier on the most effective and elusive spy of the Renaissance. I invite you not on a museum tour, but on an intellectual covert operation. Together, we will crack the code of his notebooks to look past the gleaming facade of a Renaissance titan and discern the cold, pragmatic mind of a strategist who charted the future. To understand Leonardo, momentarily set aside images of sun-drenched galleries. Transport yourself to Italy in the late 15th century. Imagine the thick, multi-layered air of a Florentine street. It's saturated with the scent of freshly tanned leather from hundreds of workshops, the sweet aroma of almond biscuits drifting from bakeries, and the heavy frankincense wafting from the cathedral's wide-open doors. But beneath this veneer, another, harsher bouquet lurks. The stench of waste dumped directly into the Arno River, the acrid fumes of coal from forges, and the ubiquitous biting smell of human sweat. The city itself is a living, breathing, and often foul-smelling organism, where luxury and squalor, genius and grime jostle for space in the same cramped alleyways. Now listen closely. This is no contemplative silence. Instead, it's a ceaseless hum. The creak of wooden carts on cobblestones, the piercing cries of market vendors, the sculptor's hammer chipping sparks from marble, and somewhere on the city's outskirts, the monotonous clang of steel on steel. It's the mercenaries, the condottieri, drilling on the training grounds. In this Italy, war wasn't an event. It was a permanent state, the very backdrop of life. The clash of their weapons was as familiar a city sound as the ringing of church bells. A constant tension hung in the air like dust, settling on the shoulders of everyone, from the duke to the apprentice. Betrayal was common currency, and poison in one's wine wasn't merely a plot device for a play, but a very real political argument. To survive and thrive in this world, one needed to possess a quality the Italians called virtù. Do not confuse this with our modern concept of virtue. Virtù was a potent cocktail of talent, ambition, valor, and most critically, the ability to impose one's will upon the world. It was the raw energy that allowed an individual to forge their own destiny rather than simply succumb to it. A person imbued with virtù wasn't merely a skilled professional. They were a master of the game, an artist of reality, capable of shaping the chaos of possibilities into the masterpiece of their life. For a ruler, virtù meant the ability to seize and hold power at any cost, for an artist to create the unprecedented, and for an engineer to design what would utterly transform the rules of war. Alongside virtù always marched two other twin concepts. The first was Fortuna, or luck, a capricious goddess not to be implored for mercy, but rather tamed, seized by the hair, and bent to one's will. Life itself was a high-stakes gamble with Fortuna. The second was Necessità, or necessity. This was the brutal realization that to achieve a grand objective, or simply to survive, a ruler had to be prepared to commit acts that, in ordinary life, would be deemed immoral. This very triad, personal valor, the dance with Fortuna, and cruel necessity, formed the operating system of the Renaissance individual. In essence, Italy of that era wasn't a nation. It was the most brutal and innovative Silicon Valley in history. Only instead of technology, power was the commodity traded. The city-states, Milan, Florence, Venice, were rival startups. Their rulers, the Medici or the Sforza, were venture capitalists, eager to pour limitless funds into disruptive technology. And Leonardo da Vinci was their Elon Musk, and Steve Jobs rolled into one. He received offers that simply couldn't be refused, for his mind was the most valuable asset on this market. His ideas weren't mere sketches, they were blueprints for dominion. It was precisely in this atmosphere of cutthroat competition, where genius was compelled to be effective and art had to serve power, that the Leonardo we're striving to unravel was forged. He wasn't a dreamy idealist with his head in the clouds. He was a pragmatist to his core, a direct product of his ruthless yet incredibly fertile era. The environment didn't merely allow him to pursue military developments, it demanded it of him. It was a condition for his survival and the primary ticket to the resources he needed for all his other, more peaceful endeavors. The catalyst, that very spark that ignited a chain reaction, was a professional setback. In Florence, that incubator of geniuses, a 30-year-old Leonardo was just one among many. Talented, yes, but not number one. He was surrounded by acclaimed masters, Botticelli, Perugino, his own teacher, Verrocchio. Commissions came, but they either fell through, like his ambitious Adoration of the Magi, which remained a tormenting underpainting, or they failed to match his titanic ambitions. Leonardo was stifled. The Florentine Republic, governed by bankers, valued art, but primarily saw it as a tool for prestige and piety. He, however, yearned for something more. He needed a laboratory the size of an entire state and a patron who would see in him not just an artist, but a universal mind. And he found such a patron, or rather, he created him for himself. His target became Milan and its de facto ruler, Ludovico Sforza, nicknamed Il Moro, the Moor, for his dark complexion and even darker political machinations. Sforza was the polar opposite of the Florentine merchants. He was an usurper, living in constant fear of conspiracy and invasion. He needed not so much paintings to adorn cathedrals, but cannons to defend walls. He required not just artists, but engineers, strategists, spies. Ludovico Sforza was the ideal patron for that darker side of Leonardo's genius that Florence had overlooked. And so, not just an idea, but a brilliant marketing strategy encapsulated in a single letter was born. This is the famous resume that Leonardo sent to Duke Sforza around 1482. This document is the true engine of our story. Forget the humble pleas of an artist. This was an audacious, almost brazen self-presentation that turned everything on its head. Leonardo deliberately positioned himself not as a painter, but as a military engineer, a specialist in destruction and defense. He offered himself as a living weapon, as the key to total battlefield supremacy. The letter consists of 10 points, and this is no accidental structure. The first 9 are a detailed and chilling catalogue of his military competencies. He writes that he knows how to construct the lightest yet strongest bridges that can be easily transported. He knows how to drain the moats of besieged fortresses. He can design mortars that hurl a hailstorm of stones, striking terror into the enemy. He promises to create covered armored wagons, essentially the first tanks, that will smash into enemy ranks, with infantry following unharmed behind them. He details projects for siege engines, catapults, silent weapons. He offers himself as an architect, a hydraulics expert, a strategist. And only at the very end, in the 10th and final point, almost reluctantly, as if mentioning a minor hobby, he adds, "In times of peace, I believe I can compete with anyone in architecture, the construction of canals. I can also execute any work in sculpture, be it marble, bronze, or clay. In painting, I can do everything that is possible to do, no worse than anyone else, whoever they may be." This final flourish is the pinnacle of psychological manipulation. He isn't asking for work. He is offering Sforza a unique asset that none of his rivals possess. For the pragmatic and perpetually imperiled Ludovico Sforza, this letter was not just a proposal from a talented Florentine, it was a revelation. He saw not an artist seeking patronage, but a key to solving his most pressing problems. The Duke understood. This man thinks not in terms of beauty, but in terms of efficiency, power, and force. The decision was made instantly. Leonardo was invited to Milan not so much as a painter, but as a secret advisor on technology and military affairs. He was hired as a superweapon, capable of painting beautiful pictures as a convenient cover. Thus, the great shift occurred. Moving to Milan wasn't merely a change of city for Leonardo, it was a complete change of identity. From being just one of many Florentine artists, he transformed into the Duke's exclusive engineer and painter. Now, he had access to foundries, armories, secret maps, and most importantly, unlimited credit and trust from one of Italy's most powerful tyrants. That dual life was born, where behind the facade of a refined court master, an organizer of lavish festivities, and a portraitist, lurked a cold intellect, designing the future of warfare. How did Leonardo's mind work? What was the secret to this torrent of inventions centuries ahead of their time? The answer is simple and astonishing. He wasn't an inventor in our modern understanding of the word. He was history's greatest copycat. His central, overarching metaphor, the key to all his work, was that nature is the most perfect and ingenious engineer. Everything humanity needs has already been created, tested, and optimized by millions of years of evolution. One merely needs to learn how to observe correctly, dissect, and adapt. Leonardo saw the world not as a poet, but as a spy dispatched to God's workshop with the mission of stealing his blueprints. Let's take a look under the hood of this method. His famous anatomical studies weren't merely preparation for painting, they were pure engineering deconstruction. Dissecting corpses, risking accusations of heresy, he sought not the soul, but mechanical principles. Bones were levers to him, muscles were drive belts and cables, the heart was a pump with a dual valve system. The nervous system was a network of signal wires. He was the first to understand that a bird flies not by magic, but by the complex aerodynamics of its wing and the incredible power of its pectoral muscles. Studying the structure of the human skull, he saw in it not only a vessel for the mind, but also an ideal dome structure capable of withstanding colossal loads, a ready-made blueprint for an impenetrable fortress. Now, let's see how this system worked in practice. Take his famous armored carriage, the great-grandfather of the modern tank. Step 1. Define the problem. How do you deliver a group of armed men into the heart of an enemy formation, protecting them from arrows and spears? Step 2. Find a natural analog. Leonardo found it instantly, the tortoise. Its shell is a mobile, impenetrable fortress. Step 3. Engineering adaptation. He took the shell's shape as a base, making it conical so that enemy projectiles wouldn't hit head-on but would slide off to the sides. Instead of bone, he used a wooden frame covered with strong metal sheets. Inside, he placed 8 men who rotated a system of levers and gears, driving 4 wheels. Along the perimeter, he cut embrasures for rapid-fire weapons. He thought of everything, even ventilation, so the soldiers wouldn't suffocate from gunpowder smoke, or consider his obsession with flight. He didn't just sketch wings. He spent hundreds of hours observing birds and bats. He dissected their wings, drawing the bone structure and feather attachments. He understood that simply flapping wings wasn't enough. One needed to control air currents, change the angle of attack, and harness wind energy. His ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings, wasn't a fantasy, but an extremely precise attempt to translate the language of biology into the language of mechanics. The project failed only because in the 15th century there was no engine light or powerful enough to replace a bird's heart. But the principle itself had been deciphered with absolute accuracy. This method demanded not just keen observation, but also a profound understanding of interconnected fields. Leonardo was a self-taught metallurgist, tirelessly experimenting with alloys to cast cannons. He was a master of hydraulics, meticulously studying the movement of water to design canals and locks, ingenious systems that could also be deployed to drain enemy moats. He was a genius in what we would now call ergonomics. His machines were engineered with human operation squarely in mind. He grasped the principles of friction and material resistance better than any of his contemporaries. And his famous mirror writing? It wasn't merely a brilliant cipher, it was a profound method of owning knowledge, of internalizing it, forcing his brain to operate in an unconventional mode. So, what exactly comprised his creative process? It was a clear-cut, almost industrial algorithm. Step 1. Decomposition. Any grand, seemingly insurmountable problem, whether it was how to fly or how to conquer a fortress, was dissected into dozens of smaller, concrete mechanical challenges. Step 2. Analogy. For each bite-sized task, he scoured living nature, which he regarded as the ultimate reference database for existing solutions. Step 3. Translation and optimization. He translated natural principles into the language of wood, metal, ropes, and gears, adapting them to human needs and available technology. And Step 4. Codification. He meticulously sketched and described the resulting designs in his notebooks, forging history's most extensive library of ideas borrowed from nature. This, then, was the true miracle of Leonardo. He didn't passively await divine revelation. Instead, he engineered a system, a veritable assembly line for producing ingenious ideas. To his patrons, whether it was Sforza or Borgia, he wasn't prized merely as an artist capable of painting a single masterpiece. He was valued as a universal problem solver, one who could reliably deliver an effective solution for any challenge, from orchestrating a lavish court masquerade to designing weaponry capable of altering the course of history. We marvel at Leonardo's grandiose projects, yet we seldom consider their true cost. Consider, for instance, his colossal equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza. Its casting alone demanded 70 tons of bronze. Just ponder that figure for a moment. That amount of metal would have been enough to forge an entire artillery park, capable of leveling a small city. Behind that stark fact lay thousands of human hours of anonymous, back-breaking labor. Hundreds of miners clawed at rock faces, extracting copper and tin ore. Dozens of foundrymen, risking life and limb, melted metal in primitive furnaces. The ordinary Italian laborer hauling those ingots likely wasn't contemplating high art. For him, it was simply an ungodly heavy burden to be moved from point A to point B, all for the sake of a duke's ambitions and the grand vision of his court genius. Leonardo wasn't a solitary figure toiling in a vacuum. His mind was an idea-generating powerhouse, but translating those ideas into reality required hands-on execution. And one of the pivotal, yet largely forgotten figures behind the scenes was a man named Tommaso di Giovanni Massini, known to all by his moniker Zoroastro da Peretola. He wasn't an artist. He was a mechanic, a mystic, an adventurer, and essentially the chief test engineer on Da Vinci's team. If Leonardo was the brilliant designer, then Massini was the one who assembled the prototypes, sourced the materials, and perhaps even risked his own life testing his friend's wildest inventions. It was likely Massini who constructed models of flying machines, meticulously fitting wooden spars and stretching wax-impregnated fabric. It was he who experimented with alloys in the foundry, striving to find the perfect composition for cannon bronze. He was more than just an apprentice. He was a partner in risk, a pragmatist who translated Leonardo's brilliant yet abstract blueprints into tangible reality. Their bond extended beyond work, encompassing a shared passion for mysteries, for alchemy, ciphers, and all things forbidden. Without the pragmatic and handy Massini, many of Leonardo's projects would have remained mere beautiful drawings in his notebooks. He was the unnoticed cog in the genius machine, without whom the entire apparatus simply wouldn't have functioned. And here's a startling, grounded detail that brings history to life and reveals the immense sacrifices made in pursuit of knowledge. We're talking about his anatomical drawings. But where did he obtain his material for research during an era when dissecting a human body was strictly forbidden by the church and considered a grave sin? The answer is simple and chilling. he worked at night. By the flickering light of a candle, in clandestine hospital basements or his own workshop, he dissected the bodies of executed criminals or paupers who had died without family care. These corpses had to be procured in secret through sympathetic doctors or even by bribing gravediggers. He worked swiftly, inhaling the nauseating stench of decomposition, constantly terrified of being discovered. Picture this scene. The greatest artist of the Renaissance, bent over a decaying body, scalpel and tweezers meticulously separating muscle after muscle, not to paint another saint, but to understand how this incredible machine truly functions. This wasn't merely pure scientific curiosity. For Leonardo, the military engineer, it was the ultimate form of reconnaissance. By dissecting a body, he wasn't just studying anatomy, he was searching for vulnerabilities. He wanted to understand precisely how a blade or a bullet damages vital organs, how joints are structured, so he would know where to strike, and how muscles work, so he could create prosthetics for maimed soldiers or manipulators for his war machines. His clandestine, risky nocturnal vigils were less about serving art and more about gathering data to enhance the efficiency of killing. And in this gruesome fact lies the entire paradox of his genius. In 1503, at the zenith of his fame, Leonardo received the most ambitious commission of his life. And it didn't come from a tyrant, but from his native Florentine republic. The task was titanic: to end the protracted, exhausting war against the rebellious city of Pisa. But not by siege, but by a single devastating stroke of engineering genius. The idea, enthusiastically championed by the young and cynical politician Niccolo Machiavelli, was astonishingly audacious. To divert the Arno River, the region's main waterway, to deprive Pisa of sea access, drain its lands, and bring it to its knees without a single shot fired. This was a project worthy of Roman emperors, a perfect storm of political ambition, military necessity, and technological hubris. For Leonardo, this was the chance of a lifetime, a chance to prove that his intellect was a more potent weapon than any army. He plunged headlong into the work. Dozens of maps, hundreds of calculations, blueprints for colossal earth-moving machines, designs for locks and dams. On paper, everything looked flawless. The plan was so detailed it seemed already a fait accompli. The Republic allocated immense funds. Hundreds of laborers and engineers were deployed to realize the grand vision. A monumental construction project began, watched with bated breath by all of Italy. This was intended to be more than just a victory. It was to be a triumph of human reason over nature and history. But reality proved far more stubborn than even the most precise calculations. The river refused to be tamed. The marshy soil swallowed the constructed dams, and the primitive excavators, brilliantly designed by Leonardo, became mired in the mud. Progress was agonizingly slow, devouring the budget at a monstrous rate. Angry letters streamed from Florence, while laughter echoed from Pisa. The enemy wasn't just observing. They launched sabotage raids, destroying at night what little had been built during the day. And here emerged the core dialectic of Leonardo's genius. His strength had always been his ability to see the world as a perfectly tuned mechanism. He believed in logic, in calculation, in the idea that any system could be understood, dismantled, and reassembled only better. This faith allowed him to design a flying machine by studying a bird's wing and a tank by replicating a turtle's shell. But a river isn't a mechanism. It's a living, chaotic, unpredictable organism. And the very crystalline clarity of his mind, his unwavering belief in blueprints and formulas, became his greatest vulnerability. He calculated everything except for the factor of chaos. His perfect lines on a map couldn't account for the viscosity of actual mud. His mathematical models were powerless against a sudden downpour. His ingenious yet overly complex machines, ahead of their time, broke down in the hands of unskilled laborers. The very systemic approach that was his greatest gift turned against him when confronted by raw, unsystematic, and irrational reality. He attempted to impose his ideal mental grid upon the world, but the world simply tore it to shreds. The unraveling came in the autumn of 1504. Seasonal rains transformed the Arno into a raging torrent. The unfinished canals and dams meant to tame the river became a deadly trap. The water breached the weakened defenses and surged not into a new channel, but backward, inundating the entire Florentine camp, destroying costly equipment and turning the greatest construction project of the Renaissance into one gigantic fetid swamp. The project wasn't just a failure, it culminated in a complete, humiliating fiasco. This was a catastrophe not only financially and militarily, it was the collapse of an entire philosophy. The man who was convinced he could subjugate the universe with the power of intellect was publicly thrashed by the very force of nature he had so presumptuously tried to control. And gazing upon this man-made swamp, at the wreckage of his machines and his hopes, he must have asked himself one terrifying question. What if the world isn't as logical as he had imagined? What if there are forces that cannot be understood, calculated, or subdued? Was the Arno River fiasco simply a tragic error of genius? Most historians agree with that version. But there is another, far more cynical theory whispered in the corridors of academia. According to it, neither Leonardo nor his political patron Machiavelli were so naive as to believe in a 100% success rate. What if the project's main objective wasn't so much a real river diversion as it was a grandiose act of psychological warfare? What if it was history's most expensive attempt to demoralize the enemy by showing them that Florence was literally willing to move mountains and turn rivers backward to get its way? In this interpretation, the failure is merely a side effect of a gambit in a game where the very act of the wager itself was a powerful political maneuver. Let's discuss the scale of this gamble. The project devoured thousands of gold florins monthly. To make this abstract sum tangible, let's translate it into the language of war. With that money, one could have hired and maintained a small but highly effective army of condottieri, who could have, if not stormed Pisa, then at least carried out constant raids, cut off supply routes, and exhausted the enemy in a classic war of attrition. Florence, however, chose to invest the equivalent of an annual military budget into a single, incredibly risky technological startup. Moreover, this construction became a gigantic economic pump. Republic money flowed into the pockets of contractors, suppliers of timber and stone, engineers, and thousands of illiterate diggers for whom this project was the only chance to feed their families. An entire infrastructure of taverns and temporary barracks sprang up around the construction site. Perhaps for the pragmatic Machiavelli, it was also a way to solve unemployment and strengthen the loyalty of certain segments of the population, channeling state funds into the right direction under the guise of a great patriotic goal. Yet, beyond its surface, the project concealed a profound, secret purpose. The attempt to tame the Arno wasn't merely an engineering feat. It was a political manifesto, a declaration sent across all of Italy. Florence, the city of bankers, poets, and artists, was staking its claim to a new kind of power, technological might. This was a direct message to its rivals, Venice and Milan. While you wage war with swords and cannons, we are learning to command the elements. We are the inheritors not just of Caesar, but of the Roman engineers who built the aqueducts. We are the future. In this context, Leonardo wasn't just a hired specialist. He was the living embodiment of this nascent doctrine. His mind, capable of grasping and reshaping the laws of nature, was Florence's chief strategic asset. And even the project's failure didn't diminish the power of this declaration. It demonstrated the sheer scale of ambition and risk the Republic was prepared to undertake. Thus, the story of the Arno ceases to be a simple tale of failure. It was a multifaceted phenomenon. On the one hand, a desperate military gambit. On the second, a cynical psychological operation. On the third, a massive economic project. And on the fourth, a daring philosophical declaration about humanity's dominion over nature. And only by grasping all these hidden currents can we truly comprehend the full scope of the drama that unfolded in the Tuscan wetlands. And now, having journeyed alongside Leonardo from a Florentine outsider to Italy's most sought-after mind, having witnessed his ruthless self-promotion, the cold mechanics of his genius, and the humiliating fiasco on the Arno River, the full picture begins to emerge. All these disparate fragments, encrypted notebooks, tank designs, anatomical studies, and failed projects, coalesce into a single, astonishing tapestry. We no longer see an artist who dabbled in engineering for a livelihood, but a systems analyst of total scope, for whom painting was merely one among a multitude of investigative tools and an ideal cover for his primary, far more dangerous work. So, what then is the key to the phenomenon of Leonardo da Vinci? Why did the great humanist so obsessively design instruments of death? The answer lies in the fact that, for Leonardo himself, this paradox simply didn't exist. The division between high art and low engineering, between creation and destruction, that's our modern lens. In his mind, no such wall stood. For him, both the Mona Lisa and a shrapnel-spewing mortar were answers to the very same fundamental question. How does this work? His genius lay elsewhere. He was the first in history to grasp that everything in this world, from the human body to the state, from a bird's flight to a cannonball's trajectory, possesses a singular underlying mechanic. He understood that the principles of hydraulics governing a river's flow were absolutely identical to those driving blood circulation in arteries. He saw that the system of levers and joints in a bat's wing could be replicated to engineer a siege engine. He wasn't interested in moral judgments. He was neither a pacifist nor a militarist. He was a diagnostician of reality. His patrons, be they the Sforzas or the Borgias, presented him with a task: to create the most beautiful portrait or the most effective cannon in the world. And he, like a perfect mechanism, delivered the optimal solution, founded upon a profound understanding of nature's laws. His true and sole patron wasn't Florence or Milan. His patron was truth itself, knowledge for its own sake. Art was his method for exploring optics and psychology. Anatomy, his way to grasp biomechanics. Military engineering, his means to practically study the laws of physics, ballistics, and material resistance. He was a spy not in the enemy's camp, but within the very fabric of the cosmos. And his notebooks are his dispatches, an encrypted report on how the universe is wired. And when we grasp this, the sheer scale of his personality truly begins to awe and terrify. This is no longer merely the pragmatism of a mercenary or the curiosity of a scientist. This is an entirely new, almost superhuman perspective on the world. A perspective where the universe is a gigantic, intricate mechanism that can, and indeed must, be disassembled to understand its operational principles. Leonardo didn't just paint the future, he was trying to hack the operating system of reality. He studied the structure of the eye to understand how we perceive light, and then immediately designed incendiary mirrors capable of burning enemy ships. He marveled at the design of the human heart to understand how blood is pumped, and then promptly developed powerful pumps to drain swamps and enemy moats. For him, these weren't disparate tasks, they were interconnected challenges. He was the first to see the world not as a divine creation to be revered, but as a collection of engineering problems to be solved. This transcends politics and warfare. It's a vision of titanic, almost blasphemous proportions. An attempt not just to understand the world, but to achieve complete, total control over it, founded on a deep knowledge of its fundamental laws. And in this sense, Leonardo da Vinci truly was the most dangerous man of his era. Not because he served tyrants, but because he offered humanity a power for which it was not, and perhaps never will be, ready. The domino effect unleashed by Leonardo proved far more potent than any of his military mechanisms. His most significant and most destructive invention wasn't the tank or the machine gun, It was a brand new way of looking at the world. His observe, dissect, replicate method, his engineering gaze upon the universe, this is the very seed from which all modern science blossomed. Though his notebooks lay hidden from the world for centuries, the idea itself permeated the air. It was precisely this approach, to trust one's own eyes and experience rather than authorities, that Galileo Galilei would embrace to revolutionize our understanding of the cosmos. And following him came Newton, who formulated the laws of mechanics, definitively transforming the world from a divine mystery into a complex yet knowable machine. Leonardo unwittingly became the architect of the very scientific revolution that shaped our modern world. And the traces of his genius we find today in the most unexpected places, often without even realizing it. Every time you drive a car, fly in an airplane, or simply use a washing machine, dozens of ball bearings, a simple and brilliant invention that drastically reduces friction, are at work within these devices. The first detailed drawing of this mechanism is found precisely in Da Vinci's codices. Every time you admire an elegant spiral staircase, know that Leonardo was obsessed with helical forms, seeing in them a universal law of nature, and he perfected their architectural embodiment. But his most profound legacy is seen where science and art converge once more. Open any modern medical atlas with its incredibly detailed and comprehensible illustrations. This is a direct descendant of Leonardo's anatomical drawings. Before him, anatomy was the domain of physicians, and its depictions were crude, schematic representations. He was the first to combine the precision of the scalpel with the talent of an artist, creating not just drawings, but visual aids, true maps of the human body. Modern computed tomography and three-dimensional modeling of organs are merely technological extensions of the revolution in visualizing knowledge that he single-handedly accomplished 500 years ago. However, here awaits the central paradox of his legacy. Leonardo was the last and most perfect universal man for whom no boundaries existed between disciplines. His goal was synthesis, the creation of a unified, all-encompassing picture of the world. Yet, the very scientific method he pioneered eventually led to the exact opposite outcome, to the great schism of knowledge. Science detached itself from art, engineering from humanitarian thought. The world fractured into two warring camps, the physicists and the poets. The man who sought to connect everything unwittingly became the father of a world divided into narrow specializations. His holistic, integrated approach was fragmented into hundreds of small, disconnected scientific fields. Scientists began to delve ever deeper into their niche areas, losing the ability to see the grand picture that he perceived so clearly. The dream of total knowledge turned into the reality of a fragmented world, where a brilliant physicist might understand nothing of poetry and a dazzling historian, nothing of the laws of thermodynamics. Thus, we live in a world that is simultaneously a triumph and a betrayal of Leonardo's ideas. We reap the fruits of his engineering approach every single day, yet we have almost entirely lost his universality. And perhaps the chief challenge of the 21st century is the attempt to become a little more like him once again. Today, in creating interdisciplinary sciences like bioengineering or neuroaesthetics, we are, in essence, trying to piece back together the very mirror in which he once saw the world as unified and whole. Look at our world, an era of ruthless competition where technological giants, much like Renaissance city-states, wage continuous war for markets and minds, where brilliant engineers and programmers in classified labs create technologies capable of altering the very nature of humanity and society, where venture capital funds and governments, acting as modern-day Medicis and Sforzas, are prepared to invest billions in any idea promising a decisive advantage. Is this not the very same 15th century Italy, merely on a global scale? We, like Leonardo, live in an age of dizzying change, where technological progress hurtles forward at such a pace that our ethics and morals simply cannot keep up. We marvel at breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and autonomous systems. But much like Leonardo's patrons, we primarily demand efficiency from these technologies, not wisdom. We are concerned with what a new technology can do, and far less with its long-term consequences. We, like the Florentines dreaming of draining a swamp with one brilliant stroke, believe there's an elegant technological solution to every complex problem. And in this self-deception, we risk repeating the failure on the Arno River, only on a planetary scale. And here, Leonardo's story crystallizes for us one most crucial and non-trivial lesson. It's not about the commonplace truth that genius and villainy can coexist in one person. The lesson is deeper and more terrifying. It lies in the fact that the most dangerous state of mind is not malevolence, but a total, almost divine detachment. Leonardo was obsessed with the question, how, but almost never asked why. How to make a person fly, how to make a cannon shoot faster, how to make colors on a portrait glow forever. For his mind, these were tasks of the same order, devoid of moral dimension. He created a model of the world in which knowledge is separated from wisdom and efficiency from responsibility. In this model, the creator bears no responsibility for their creation. They simply solve the assigned problem like a perfect computer. They hand their patron the sharpest knife in the world without caring whether it will be used to cut bread or to slit a neighbor's throat. It is precisely this virus of intellectual detachment, this idea of pure, sterile knowledge, that remains Leonardo's most enduring and most unsettling legacy. We are all his direct descendants. Every time we create an algorithm that optimizes profit but leads to layoffs, every time we develop communication technology that ultimately isolates people, every time we chase efficiency for efficiency's sake, we are operating within Leonardo's paradigm. We become brilliant engineers but cease to be wise human beings. And this is the preliminary conclusion of his incredible life. Leonardo da Vinci didn't discover America or new laws of physics for humanity. He opened Pandora's box of a new way of thinking, a cold, analytical, engineering gaze upon the world. This perspective granted us incredible power, but it also threatens to strip us of our humanity. And his story isn't just a tale of the past. It's an eternal reminder that the ability to change the world is not the same as the wisdom to change it for the better. Let's for a moment set aside our usual perspective and look at Leonardo through the eyes of his rivals. Not as a genius, but as a threat. Take, for example, the Republic of Venice, a 1,000-year-old maritime power built on trade, espionage, and the world's most efficient military-industrial complex, the famed Venetian arsenal. The Venetians were no barbarians. Theirs was a sophisticated, pragmatic, and deeply conservative civilization. Their strength didn't lie in solitary geniuses, but in their system, in processes refined over centuries, in a strict guild hierarchy, in the collective will of an aristocracy for whom the interests of the state transcended any personal ambition. From the lofty vantage point of Venetian palaces, Leonardo da Vinci appeared not as a titan of the Renaissance, but as a dangerous upstart, a charlatan, and a dilettante. Just think about it. He embarked on dozens of projects, yet brought almost none to completion. He called himself an engineer, but belonged to none of the esteemed guilds. He promised his patrons flying machines and armored chariots, inventions any sane Venetian master would have dismissed as a madman's ravings. His patrons, like Sforza or Borgia, were seen by the Venetian Senate not as enlightened benefactors, but as reckless tyrants who had staked the fate of their states on the fantasies of a single, highly unreliable man. For a Venetian engineer, whose father and grandfather had built the world's finest galleys from time-tested blueprints, Leonardo's very method was a cultural shock. In their world, mastery lay in perfecting traditional technologies. Leonardo, however, openly flouted all traditions. He didn't merely improve upon what existed, He sought to create something from nothing, drawing inspiration not from the treatises of ancient authors, but from the intricate structure of a bat's wing. To the systemic, ordered Venetian mind, this was more than mere innovation. It was heresy. It was the demolition of the very foundation upon which their civilization rested, a foundation of continuity, specialization, and collective experience. And herein lay the tragedy of their predictability. The Venetian Republic was perfectly prepared for any war of the past. Its arsenal could launch an entire fleet within mere weeks. Its diplomats and spies knew everything about the strength of armies and the thickness of enemy fortress walls. Their system was strong, finely tuned, and utterly predictable. But it was utterly unprepared for a clash with a new type of thinking. It could calculate the number of cannons an enemy possessed, but it could not calculate an idea born in the mind of one man. Their traditionalism, their faith in proven methods, their specialization, all that had been their greatest strength for centuries, suddenly became their greatest weakness. They were ready for a war of steel and gold, but Leonardo offered his patrons a war of imagination. And while the Venetians perfected their ships, he designed submarines capable of silently sinking their entire fleet. They found themselves in the position of a mighty yet lumbering army confronting an elusive saboteur who played by no rules and wielded weapons not even imagined in their military manuals. Their world was doomed, not because it was weak, but because it was too orderly and unprepared for a genius who thought beyond order. In the year 1502, Leonardo took the most controversial and riskiest step of his career. He entered the service of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. This was not just another contract, it was a pact with the devil. Cesare was more than a mere commander. He was the living embodiment of a new, amoral politics that his friend Machiavelli would later describe in his treatise, The Prince. He was a brilliant, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective predator. Cities surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. He betrayed allies the moment they outlived their usefulness. For him, neither honor nor friendship existed, only the objective. And it was to this man, whose hands were stained crimson, that the era's greatest humanist hired himself out. Leonardo's inner world during this period remains the most secluded and darkest chapter of his biography. He became Borgia's chief military engineer and cartographer. He traveled with the army, not as a soldier, but as its all-seeing eye, its very brain. He created astonishingly accurate maps of conquered territories, true masterpieces centuries ahead of their time. But beneath the beauty of these lines and watercolor washes lay a chilling reality. Every hill charted was a potential position for artillery. Every river was not merely a natural feature, but a line of defense or an invasion route. He transformed the land into an abstract diagram for waging war. This was the pinnacle of his detachment. He no longer saw people, he saw resources. He didn't see cities, he saw targets. The burden of responsibility and proximity to absolute unrestrained power transformed him from an explorer into an instrument. It was in Borgia's entourage that he witnessed an event that reveals the true cost of his ambitions, the infamous massacre at Senigallia. Cesare Borgia, wishing to eliminate his former allies, mercenary captains or condottieri who had conspired against him, lured them into the city under the guise of peace negotiations. Among them was Vitellozzo Vitelli, one of the most renowned military commanders of the era. Leonardo almost certainly knew these men personally, having moved in the same military circles. They were his colleagues in the craft of war. When the condottieri arrived in Senigallia, leaving their troops outside the city walls, they were immediately seized. That very night, by Cesare's personal order, Vitelli and another captain were strangled. Leonardo was there. He was at Borgia's headquarters. He could not have been unaware of what was happening. He saw his patron, smiling and engaging in polite conversation, coldly issue the command for the murder of men who just yesterday had been his comrades. And what did Leonardo do? Nothing. He did not protest. He did not leave. He stayed and continued his work. In that moment, it wasn't someone else's life sacrificed on the altar of success, but a piece of his own soul. He became an accomplice, not through action, but through silent consent. The story of Vitellozzo Vitelli is the story of what Leonardo sacrificed for the opportunity to work and to survive. He sacrificed his conscience. He chose efficiency and security, turning a blind eye to a monstrous atrocity. And this cold, pragmatic choice is perhaps the darkest secret of his genius. He understood that to remain close to power and to have access to boundless resources for his research, he would have to amputate a part of his own humanity. He became as cold and perfect as the mechanisms he designed. The Milanese court of Ludovico Sforza, where Leonardo first arrived, was far from a monolithic cultural space. It was a laboratory, a boiling point where different worlds already collided. Local, stern Lombard practicality mixed with the refined Florentine humanism brought by intellectual migrants like Leonardo himself. Architecture was the best example of this. The medieval, brutal Castello Sforzesco was, by the Duke's will, to be transformed into a gleaming Renaissance palace. This wasn't a synthesis, but at first a stark conflict between two aesthetics, two worldviews, superimposed upon each other. Leonardo found himself right on this tectonic fault line, attempting to reconcile Gothic might with humanist harmony. Then, in the year 1499, a third, utterly alien force invaded this already complex world, the French army. For the Milanese, this was more than just an occupation. It was a cultural shock. French aristocrats seemed like barbarians to them, loud, arrogant, dressed in heavy, clumsy attire. Their language sounded guttural and harsh compared to the melodic Italian dialects. Their notions of honor and war were based on chivalric romances, while Italians had long since transformed warfare into a cynical science. It wasn't merely two armies that clashed, but two entire universes. This collision birthed astonishing and strange hybrids. Leonardo, always an insatiable observer, couldn't ignore it. He absorbed everything. The Northern European art that arrived with the French, with its meticulous attention to detail and atmospheric, misty landscapes, made a profound impression on him. He didn't merely copy it. He took that northern mysticism and fused it with his ironclad Italian logic, with an impeccable understanding of anatomy and perspective. Thus was born his famous sfumato technique, a hazy, smoky veil that blurs contours. This is the ideal cultural hybrid, the soul of the North, given a body in the South. The Mona Lisa isn't just a portrait, it's a monument to that grand cultural synthesis that occurred within his consciousness. Another arena for hybridization became the court festivities that Leonardo organized for Sforza. These weren't mere balls. They were spectacular multimedia shows where he blended art, science, and magic. The most famous was the Feast of Paradise. For this, Leonardo the engineer constructed a gigantic mechanical hemisphere depicting the celestial sphere, which rotated to show the movement of the planets. And Leonardo the artist created costumes for actors portraying ancient gods. It was an explosive mix of medieval mystery, classical mythology, and cutting-edge Renaissance mechanics. Something entirely new, which could only have been born in this melting pot. And how did all this change the life of the average person? The simple Milanese artisan suddenly found himself in a new reality. The French occupying garrison demanded wine, but not the familiar local vintage. They wanted something similar to Burgundy. Tailors received orders for dresses in French fashion, which they considered tasteless, but which paid well. Old feudal habits, which Italy had begun to shed, returned with the French barons. At the same time, Italian engineers and artists gained access to new technologies and ideas brought by the invaders. Life became a constant act of balancing, how to preserve one's identity while adapting to rules dictated by an alien power. And at the center of it all, was Leonardo. He didn't just live at the crossroads of civilizations, he was that crossroads. He spoke several languages, read Latin authors, worked for Italian tyrants and French kings. He equally admired the logic of a Roman aqueduct and the complexity of a Gothic cathedral. His mind was that very great melting pot, where seemingly incompatible ideas were refined, purged of dross, and fused into a new, unprecedented alloy. He was the living embodiment of his era's globalization, and it is precisely why his genius proved so universal and timeless. Leonardo da Vinci was a genius not only in engineering, but also in what we would today call personal branding and public relations. He didn't wait for fame to find him. He deliberately constructed his public image. The legend that he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands, or his habit of buying caged birds at the market only to immediately release them. These weren't just charming anecdotes. These were carefully orchestrated actions designed to create an image of superhuman strength and humanism. His mirror writing, beyond its practical purpose of concealing his notes, served to cultivate an aura of mystery and exclusivity. He presented himself not as a craftsman, but as a magus initiated into the secrets of nature. This myth was actively supported by his patrons as well. When Ludovico Sforza commissioned Leonardo to create an equestrian statue of his father, he wasn't just commissioning a monument, he was commissioning the grandest propaganda piece of its time. The gigantic horse, intended to surpass everything created since antiquity, was a visual manifesto shouting across all of Italy, "Milan under Sforza is the new Rome, and our ruler is the new emperor." Leonardo was the principal director of this spectacle, and his art was its most effective medium. But for every stroke of propaganda, there was a counterstroke. Leonardo's adversaries and his patrons' enemies were wide awake and vigilant. Rival artists and engineers whispered tales of his sluggishness, his unreliability, and his notorious habit of leaving projects perpetually unfinished. This was a calculated smear campaign, a dark art of public relations designed to tarnish his reputation in the eyes of potential patrons. He faced accusations of heresy, necromancy, and sodomy. Some of these rumors held a kernel of truth, others were malicious slander, but all of them conspired to paint him as a dangerous, unpredictable genius, an alien figure to pious society. Many of these myths, it turns out, were incredibly tenacious. For instance, the notion of Leonardo as a clandestine head of some esoteric order, a guardian of ancient knowledge, this is a myth born precisely from the counter-propaganda that sought to brand him a heretic. Later, it was romanticized and has endured to this very day, fueled by popular novels and films. In reality, however, he was a pragmatist to his core, not a mystic. And here we find the most striking example of how history is indeed written by the victors. Consider the celebrated fresco, The Last Supper. The official narrative, the one we all know, hails it as a stroke of genius, a brilliant depiction of the evangelical drama's climactic moment. But let us peer at it through the eyes of the monks for whom it was originally conceived. Leonardo toiled over it for an agonizingly long time, with immense interruptions, drawing the furious ire of the monastery's abbot. He employed an experimental painting technique, oil on dry plaster, one that began to crumble and decay even during his own lifetime. To his contemporaries, it was less a triumph and more an extremely problematic and exorbitantly costly undertaking. What is more, sources from the losing side, anonymous denunciations and letters from rivals, paint a starkly different picture altogether. In these accounts, Leonardo appears not as a pious artist, but rather as a cynical experimentalist who exploited a sacred narrative to solve purely technical puzzles. How to convey the most complex spectrum of human emotions, how to construct the perfect perspective. The legend that he scoured Milan's criminal underworld for a face to embody Judas is not merely an amusing anecdote. It is an echo of those very rumors that depicted him as a man cavorting with society's dregs and transferring their sinful visages onto sacred images. Thus, what stands today as a pinnacle of spiritual art for us was, for many of his contemporaries, a scandalous and almost blasphemous art project. As always, the version that prevailed was the one crafted by Leonardo himself and his devoted admirers. The fateful decision that ultimately warped his original vision wasn't sudden, like a dagger's thrust. No, it was a slow poison, seeping into the bloodstream over years. The point of no return came with Leonardo's departure from Italy for France in the year 1516. Italy, with its ceaseless wars, betrayals, and ruthless competition, served as the harsh yet incredibly fertile crucible where his genius could truly ignite. It presented him with impossible challenges, pushed his mind to its absolute limits, and confronted him with the darkest facets of human nature. In France, however, at the court of King Francis I, a quiet, honorable, and utterly sterile old age awaited him. He had traded the battlefield of ideas for a gilded cage. The end ceased to justify the means, because the sole end now became the means itself, a comfortable and secure existence under the wing of a powerful monarch. This choice led to an ultimate internal schism, one best viewed through the prism of his eternal rivalry with another titan, Michelangelo Buonarroti. If Leonardo embodied the cool, detached intellect of the Renaissance, Michelangelo was its blazing, tormented heart. They were like two poles of a single era, two former kindred spirits in the grand project of remaking the world, whose paths diverged forever. Both served the powerful of their age, yet they did so in profoundly different ways. Michelangelo, conversely, remained loyal to the primal, almost divine ideal. For him, art was not a science, but a sacred service, a tormented dialogue with God and with the very material itself. He gnawed at marble, leaving the traces of his chisel and his blood upon it. He painted the Sistine Chapel while lying on his back, crippling his body, clashing with the Pope, yet creating a masterpiece imbued with fierce faith and anguish. He stayed in Italy, sharing its tragic fate, fighting for his beloved Florence, suffering and creating. Leonardo, however, chose the path of pragmatic reality. He embraced a new role, that of a court sage, a living treasure in a king's esteemed collection. He preferred the comfort of Chateau du Clos Lucé to the agony of creation on the scaffolding of Rome. A symbolic act marking this profound turning point was one of Leonardo's last projects, created for the amusement of the French king. It was a mechanical lion, a marvel of engineering ingenuity. It could take several steps on its own before its chest dramatically opened, revealing a bouquet of heraldic lilies, the emblem of the French monarchy. In this automaton, as in a mirror, the entire tragedy of his life's end was reflected. The mind that once designed weapons capable of altering the course of history and machines intended to lift humanity into the sky now crafted an exquisite toy. This was no longer the Leonardo who had striven to crack the universe's code. This was a genius in retirement, applying his colossal knowledge to devise parlor tricks. Energy that could have moved mountains was redirected into a mere whistle. The mechanical lion was technically flawless, but spiritually dead. It stood as a monument not to the power of his genius, but to his surrender. He had ceased to be an engineer of the future and became a designer of entertainment for the present. He brought his greatest treasures with him to France, thousands of pages of notebooks and several unfinished paintings, including the Mona Lisa. But he brought them not to complete and offer to the world. He brought them to die alongside them. His codices, once working journals brimming with fresh ideas, transformed into an archive he lazily sifted through and organized. The Mona Lisa became his personal obsession, which he refined until his final day, no longer for a patron, but solely for himself. The vast knowledge he had amassed throughout his life was privatized and locked away. It ceased to be a tool for world-changing and became merely a collection of memories. Thus, In quietude and honor, far from the storms that had birthed him, Leonardo betrayed his fundamental principle. That principle was that knowledge should serve discovery, not comfort. He, however, chose comfort. The great spy returned from his mission, but refused to write the report. He preferred to live out his days, reveling in the status of a legend he himself had cultivated. The Italian Wars, that very backdrop against which Leonardo's drama unfolded, became a true cataclysm for the Apennine Peninsula, forever altering its landscape. This was more than just a shift in power. It was a complete overhaul of the entire political ecosystem. The primary losers were precisely those proud and independent city-states that had given birth to the Renaissance. Milan, Florence, Naples, all of them, one after another, forfeited their autonomy, becoming mere pawns in the grand game of European monarchies. Along with them vanished the old aristocracy of the sword, the condottieri, like those ruthlessly executed by Cesare Borgia. Their personal valor and tactical artistry proved useless against the avalanches of Swiss infantry and the might of French artillery. So, who were the victors? Firstly, the ultramontanes, those beyond the mountains, the kings of France and Spain, who emerged as Italy's new masters. And secondly, within Italy itself, a new elite arose. These were not warriors, but nimble administrators, shrewd diplomats, and of course bankers who, discerning the prevailing winds, began to finance not local princelings, but the powerful foreign crowns. These individuals thrived by serving their new overlords, and it was they who inherited the palaces and lands of the old aristocracy. A great substitution occurred. The cult of personal valor gave way to the cult of survival through compromise and collaboration. The economy of this new world was quite literally built upon the bones of the Renaissance. Endless wars demanded staggering sums of money. Invading armies needed to be fed, armed, and paid their wages. As a result, the golden stream that for centuries had flowed into Italy from across Europe reversed its course. Wealth amassed by generations of merchants and bankers was drained from the country in the form of taxes, indemnities, and outright plunder. Italy, once the financial heart of the world, was slowly transformed into its cash cow. But this was only one facet of the picture. The real economic tectonic shift was happening far from the battlefields. While Italians were tearing each other apart, Columbus had already stumbled upon the Americas, and Vasco da Gama had charted a sea route to India. The economic center of the world was migrating from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. Venice and Genoa, which had grown rich for centuries on trade with the East, suddenly found themselves relegated to the sidelines of new global routes. Italy resembled a magnificent train station from which all the main railway lines had suddenly been rerouted. The buildings still gleamed, but the trains were now bypassing them entirely. All of this spawned a profound collective trauma. The sense of pride and self-assurance that permeated the entire culture of the High Renaissance gave way to feelings of humiliation and impotence. The apotheosis of this tragedy was the sack of Rome in 1527, which occurred a mere 8 years after Leonardo's death. The Eternal City was abandoned to the desecration of savage mercenaries. This event sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world and marked a symbolic end to an era. As a result, people's worldviews fundamentally changed. The humanists' optimistic belief that humankind was the master of its own destiny yielded to the bitter realization that the world was governed not by reason and valor, but by blind fortuna and brute force. This new, unsettling, and disillusioned outlook was perfectly mirrored in the art of mannerism, with its contorted lines and dissonant colors. Those who survived this upheaval grasped one simple truth. Their brilliant civilization had proven incredibly fragile. And Leonardo, with his late Renaissance melancholy and flight to France, was among the first to feel the subterranean tremors of the approaching catastrophe. Behind all of Leonardo's actions, from painting frescoes to designing catapults, lay one all-consuming philosophical concept, which he himself encapsulated in two words: saper vedere, knowing how to see. This was no passive contemplation. It was an aggressive, almost predatory approach to life. For Leonardo, seeing meant dissecting, analyzing, and cracking the code. He believed that nature was the greatest book, written not with letters, but with the laws of mechanics, and that the human eye, armed with reason and experience, was the only instrument capable of reading this text. The authority of Aristotle or the Bible meant nothing to him if it contradicted what he observed with his own eyes during a dissection or an experiment. This faith in the supremacy of personal experience over any dogma was his primary driving force. But this idea was not born in a vacuum. Leonardo breathed air already electrified by the works of another Florentine genius, the true éminence grise of the era, the philosopher Marsilio Ficino. It was Ficino, head of the Platonic Academy, who rediscovered the writings of Plato and Plotinus for Europe. He wasn't Leonardo's direct teacher, but he created the intellectual atmosphere in which his genius could flourish. Ficino reintroduced the idea that man was not a wretched sinner, but an earthly god, a microcosm reflecting the entire universe. He argued that by understanding oneself and the world, one came to understand God himself. This concept provided Leonardo's titanic ambitions with a philosophical justification and an almost sacred meaning. His drive to comprehend everything under the sun ceased to be mere curiosity and transformed into the highest form of service. Standing in stark contrast to this burgeoning humanistic philosophy was a powerful, centuries-old doctrine: scholasticism. It was the dominant intellectual system of the Middle Ages, rooted in Aristotelian logic, but cleverly adapted to serve Christian theology. Adherents to scholasticism held that truth was not something to be discovered, but rather already revealed in sacred texts and the writings of the Church Fathers. Their method wasn't about unearthing the new, but about the masterful commentary and logical harmonization of existing doctrines. It was a world where the ultimate argument was a well-placed quote, and the primary tool, the syllogism. The collision of ideas between Leonardo and scholasticism represents the foundational conflict of the Renaissance itself. Scholastics sought to understand how the world worked by poring over ancient texts in hushed libraries. Leonardo, conversely, pursued the same understanding, often kneeling knee-deep in mud and gore, dissecting cadavers and testing his ingenious machines. It was a battle between second-hand knowledge and knowledge forged by direct, personal experience. It was a dispute between those who believe and those who verify through empirical observation. And Leonardo stood as the undisputed field marshal of the verifiers. The magnificent system that birthed Leonardo, the brilliant yet ruthless world of the Italian city-states, began to devour itself long before his own demise. No sooner had it reached its zenith in the late 15th century than processes of entropy began to unfold within its very core. There was no formidable external foe that arrived to dismantle this world. The system, tragically, destroyed itself. That very competition, which had fueled the Renaissance by driving rulers to vie for luxury and geniuses to contend in talent, morphed into a deadly, self-destructive animosity. Milan invited the French to weaken Naples. The Pope allied with the Spanish to crush Venice. Each ruler believed they were skillfully leveraging foreign power for their own gain, failing to grasp that together they were opening the gates to predators who had arrived not as guests, but as hunters. Italy, much like Alexander the Great's empire after his death, became an arena for a furious struggle over its inheritance. But the claimants were not generals. They were powerful kings. French King Francis I, Leonardo's final patron, saw himself as the rightful heir to the Duchy of Milan. The Spanish crown laid claim to Naples and Sicily. The Holy Roman Emperor aimed to control all of northern Italy. They were not merely battling for territory. They were tearing apart the grand idea of Italian preeminence, plundering its cultural and financial treasures. Italian rulers, instead of uniting against a common threat, became mere pawns in this foreign game, betraying one another for fleeting tactical gains and ultimately losing everything. The last shard of that magnificent era, the final bastion of resistance, was Florence. In the year 1527, following the devastating sack of Rome, the Florentines, for a final time, expelled the Medici family and proclaimed the restoration of their old republic. It was a desperate gesture, a valiant attempt to turn back the clock and return to the ideals of civic liberty that had originally ignited the flames of the Renaissance. And here, history takes an incredible, tragic turn. The chief engineer responsible for the defense of besieged Florence was none other than Michelangelo. Leonardo's eternal rival, the artist who had lifelong battles with his patrons but never betrayed his homeland, was now compelled to lay down his chisel and pick up a compass. He, the creator of David, the very symbol of republican valor, was now constructing bastions to defend his dying republic against the combined armies of the Pope, who, ironically, was a Medici, and the powerful Emperor Charles V. It was an agonizing spectacle. The artist who embodied the spirit of the age was forced to become its gravedigger, desperately trying to fortify the very walls behind which this era was destined to die. The siege lasted for nearly a year. Florence fought with the fury of the doomed, but the odds were impossibly stacked against her. In August of the year 1530, betrayed by its own mercenaries, the Republic fell. This was not merely the end of one city's independence, it was the symbolic demise of the entire Italian Renaissance as a political project. The idea of the free city-state, where genius and citizen could forge history, was irrevocably crushed beneath the boots of imperial armies. Michelangelo, having narrowly escaped the victor's vengeance, survived to become the artist of a new counter-Reformation era, an era defined by anxiety, doubt, and lost illusions. And Florence forever became a hereditary duchy under Medici rule. The age of titans had drawn to a close. After Leonardo's death in France, his most profound legacy, thousands of pages of his notebooks, met a tragic fate. His loyal student, Francesco Melzi, meticulously preserved them until the end of his own life. But upon Melzi's passing, these priceless codices were sold for a pittance, parceled out by heirs, and scattered to the winds among Europe's aristocratic collections. The magnificent system, the unified organism of his thought, was dismembered. The world received disparate sheets adorned with beautiful drawings, but lost the key to understanding the whole. His intellectual DNA had been obliterated. For nearly 3 centuries, humanity knew Leonardo the artist, the creator of the Last Supper, but almost entirely forgot Leonardo the engineer, the anatomist, and the strategist. His boldest and most dangerous ideas lay dormant in dusty libraries. The moment of his rediscovery wasn't a sudden flash. It was a slow, gradual awakening that began in the late 18th century. The Enlightenment and the burgeoning Industrial Revolution gave rise to a new breed of individuals who looked at Leonardo's drawings and saw not art, but blueprints. They suddenly grasped that behind the depiction of a wing lay aerodynamics, behind the sketch of a cathedral, the theory of material resistance, and behind a drawing of a skull, the principles of biomechanics. The world of steam and steel had finally learned to read the language of gears and levers that Leonardo had written 300 years prior. The catalyst for this process was, ironically enough, another conqueror, Napoleon Bonaparte. During his Italian campaigns, he deliberately confiscated scientific and cultural treasures, including Da Vinci's codices. By assembling a portion of them in Paris, he unwittingly gave scholars the opportunity, for the first time in centuries, to study not isolated sheets but entire volumes. The effect was explosive. European engineers and scientists were astonished to discover that this Renaissance artist had already designed drawbridges, rolling mills, submarines, and even something akin to a bicycle. The ghost of Leonardo rose from obscurity, no longer as an artist, but as a prophet of the scientific age. Yet, every era, in rediscovering the past, inevitably reads it through its own lens, imbuing it with its own fears and hopes. The 19th century, the Romantic era, sculpted a convenient and safe myth around Leonardo. It transformed him into a solitary, misunderstood dreamer, a genius tragically ahead of his time. This image was far more comforting than the unsettling reality of a cold, pragmatic analyst who worked for some of the most ruthless tyrants. A spy's dossier was turned into the hagiography of a scientific saint. The 20th and 21st centuries went even further, giving birth to a new and most popular misreading. Leonardo as a keeper of secret knowledge, a grand master of esoteric orders who had encoded the path to the Holy Grail within his paintings. This version, widely disseminated by mass culture, became the latest and most ironic distortion of his legacy. The man who spent his life battling superstition and believed only in experience and experimentation was transformed into history's foremost mystic. Thus, the long echo of his genius reaches us in the form of two distorted reflections. On one side, the sterile image of the dreaming scientist. On the other, the conspiratorial image of the initiated mystic. Both allow us to overlook the crucial truth, the frightening reality that the greatest mind in history was willing to serve any power that granted him the opportunity to continue his primary and singular war, the war for knowledge at any cost. So, we began our journey with a simple yet piercing question. How could a genius who gifted us the quintessence of beauty also obsessively design instruments of death? Now, having navigated the labyrinths of his life, we see that this was not a personal pathology of his. It was a manifestation of a fundamental law of our civilization. Today, in top-secret laboratories, the planet's finest minds are creating artificial intelligence capable of both curing incurable diseases and controlling autonomous killer drones. The most brilliant bioengineers are learning to edit the genome to conquer hereditary illnesses while simultaneously opening Pandora's box by creating potential biological weapons. The problem of Leonardo has returned to us, but now on a monstrous global scale. Once again, like the Florentine rulers of old, we blindly believe in a technological panacea, convinced that every challenge, from climate change to social inequality, can be solved with another ingenious engineering maneuver. We have created a world that functions by his rules, a world where efficiency is valued above ethics and innovation trumps wisdom. The circle has closed. We have all become hostages of that very cold, analytical view of the world that he pioneered. And here, the central, insoluble paradox of his entire story, and perhaps the whole of human history, confronts us in full force. The pursuit of pure, unfettered knowledge, the most noble of human passions, inevitably and automatically begets the tools for total control and total destruction. The deeper we penetrate the mysteries of matter, the more potent the weapons we create. The better we understand the laws of human psychology, the more sophisticated our manipulation technologies become. Knowledge and power have proven to be two sides of the same coin, and Leonardo was the first to see this with terrifying clarity, yet he could not find the strength or the desire to sever this connection. He believed he was spying on nature, stealing its secrets for the good of humankind. But in the end, he became a double agent, unknowingly. He brought people the fire of knowledge, but with it, the capacity to burn the entire world in that same fire. His tragedy is the tragedy of our species. Our intellect invariably outpaces our wisdom, and our capabilities grow far more rapidly than our ability to bear responsibility for them. We are his direct descendants. In our hands, his parchment notebooks have transformed into endless lines of code and his mechanical automatons into self-learning neural networks. We wield power he could not even dream of. We stand on the threshold of creating a new world, one he only dimly sensed in his boldest visions. But looking at his path, his genius and his compromises, his triumphs and his solitary, often fruitless old age, it's impossible not to ask one final question. Are we merely the next, more advanced iteration of Leonardo, doomed to repeat his grand and terrible fate on a planetary scale? Or do we, perhaps for the first time in history, have a chance to meld knowledge with wisdom before our own genius ultimately destroys us?